The October night rain in 1988 poured down on Knoxville, Tennessee, as the young girl Elena Grace Holloway left the choir rehearsal at Cedar Grove Church and vanished into the thick darkness. Her sweater was found by Melton Hill Lake, and the church bell that night became the last sound anyone heard from Elena. For 3 decades, that small town lived with an unsolved mystery, where faith, sin, and fear mingled in silent prayers. When the case files were reopened, a chilling chain of discoveries pulled Knoxville back to a past they thought they had buried deep. And what was unearthed from the old church basement will force this entire community to confront the most horrifying question: have they been believing the wrong person for 33 years, or have they never truly known the truth? Friday night, October 7, 1988. Knoxville lay as if swallowing itself in a thin fog, the humidity from Melton Hill Lake creeping along the oak-shaded streets. The yellowish streetlights cast down on the asphalt, reflecting faint white streaks of mist. In the small wooden house at the end of Cedar Grove neighborhood, Mrs. Margaret Holloway stood by the window frame, still holding her cooled teacup, waiting for the familiar engine sound of the silver Chevrolet Nova that her daughter always drove every Friday night. But the clock showed nearly 11 o'clock, and the road in front of the house remained pitch black. At the same time, on the other side of town, the choir practice at Cedar Grove Baptist Church had just ended. Elena Grace Holloway, 22 years old, put her music folder into her purse and said goodbye to a few friends. She was the last to leave, lingering to turn off the stage lights and fold away a few chairs. A friend named Jenny Parker said that Elena seemed tired but still smiled, saying she would get up early tomorrow for the morning shift at the bookstore. Outside, the October wind blew gently, dry leaves swirling around the parking lot as she opened the door of the Nova, started the engine, and the headlights cut through the thick fog. The drive from the church to home was only about 10 minutes. It was the familiar route running parallel to the lake, where small bridges connected the two shores and scattered gas stations stayed open late. A few motorists later recounted seeing the lights of a small car driving slowly along that route, but no one paid attention because it was normal in Knoxville, a town where everyone knew each other and no one thought anything frightening could happen. That night, there was no rain, only fog and the characteristic silence of the American South as winter approached. Near midnight, inside the house, the old wooden clock ticked with dry chimes. Margaret picked up the landline phone to call Jenny's house, her voice hoarse with worry. Jenny said Elena had left the church more than an hour ago. She called the bookstore where her daughter worked next, but no one answered. She stepped out onto the porch, looking at the misty road, the solitary light casting through the car window of the neighbor. A chill crept down her spine. Around 1 in the morning, she drove the old pickup truck around Elena's familiar route, from the church, over the Melton Hill Bridge, then turning toward the suburban housing area. There were no signs, no headlights, no silver car, no familiar engine noise. Each curve was just darkness and still standing trees. When she returned, she opened the door to the house. Her daughter's room was still tidy, clothes neatly folded on the chair, the music notebook placed squarely on the table. There was no indication that Elena intended to go far away. Margaret sat down next to the phone, clutching the paper with the Knox County Sheriff's Office emergency number that she had once used to report a minor accident a few years ago. On the other end of the line came the dispatcher's voice, Knox County Sheriff's Office. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice calm but trembling. "I want to report a missing person. My daughter, she hasn't come home. She's never gone anywhere without telling me." That was the call logged at 1:27 a.m. on October 8, 1988, the beginning of one of the longest and most haunting missing persons cases in Knoxville history. The next morning, Knoxville was covered in a thin white mist. Weak sunlight filtered through the treetops, everything eerily quiet. In the small house at the end of Cedar Grove Street, Mrs. Margaret Holloway sat on a wooden chair, her eyes ringed with dark circles from lack of sleep. All night, she had waited for the phone to ring, for the familiar engine sound of the Chevrolet Nova, but the house remained silent. Elena's room was tidy, the bed covers smooth, her sneakers placed neatly. There were no signs that she planned to be away long. Around 8 in the morning, she threw on a sweater and went outside. The fog was still thick, the air biting cold. She drove along the route Elena usually took after choir practice. On both sides of the road, rows of trees sank into the mist, the tires crunching softly on the damp asphalt. At the curve overlooking Melton Hill Lake, The water lay flat and still, reflecting the pale gray sky. No silver car, nothing unusual, just a heavy silence. Worried, she turned the car toward Jenny Parker's house, her daughter's close friend. Jenny opened the door with a sleepy face. Mrs. Holloway asked urgently, and Jenny said the choir practice ended around 9. Elena left last, smiling, nothing out of the ordinary. The brief answer only heightened Mrs. Margaret's unease. Her always cautious daughter had never come home late without letting her know. At 10 in the morning, she arrived at the Knox County Sheriff's Office, the red brick building on Cumberland Avenue. In the duty room, an officer took the report. She recounted the entire incident, her voice trembling with fear. The officer flipped through his notebook and said, "She might have just gone somewhere, ma'am." But Margaret insisted, "My daughter doesn't go anywhere without telling me." Finally, he entered it into the file, marking it missing person, preliminary. Leaving the sheriff's office, she drove to the bookstore where Elena worked. The door was closed, the closed sign still hanging on the glass frame. Inside, everything was neat as usual. There were no signs that anyone had stopped by. She stood looking through the window, her breath fogging the glass, her heart tightening. At noon, she returned home, trying to cook something but unable to eat. The phone remained silent. Neighbors stopped by to check in, then discussed the search together. A few men took trucks around the lake. Some called the nearby gas stations for information. Knoxville was a small town where everyone knew each other. If one person went missing, the whole community worried. As afternoon fell, the weak sun faded over the Cedar Grove Church roof. Mrs. Margaret sat silently in the living room, the police report placed in front of her. On it, the bold printed word, "Missing," made her choke up. Elena had never gone far without telling her, never made her wait through such a long night. Outside, the late-season cicadas and the wind through the trees made the house feel even emptier. She knew tonight would be long again, and from now on, every passing hour would be an unnamed void in a mother's heart. Knoxville in 1988 was a typical southern town, peaceful to the point where people were more accustomed to the sound of insects than traffic. The main roads were shaded by ancient elms, connecting churches, schools, and a few small diners, where folks gathered every Sunday morning after service. Life here revolved around faith, family, and simple habits that had endured for generations. In Cedar Grove, everyone knew each other. Everyone had attended funerals, weddings, or sung together in the church choir. Anything unusual became gossip that spread in just a few hours. That's why Elena Holloway's disappearance after choir practice quickly became the topic that stunned the entire town. Elena, the 22-year-old girl, had grown up here, the only child of the widow Mrs. Margaret. She worked at a small bookstore on Gay Street, diligent and beloved by everyone. Customers often said Elena always remembered their names, always smiled, and had a way of making people feel heard. She loved music, singing in the Cedar Grove Church choir since she was 16, her clear and bright voice silencing the entire hall every time she began the first note. In that small town, Elena was the picture of goodness, politeness, and promise. A girl everyone believed would eventually leave Knoxville for farther places, for a better life. A few streets from the Holloway house stood the venerable Baptist church, with its red brick facade and tall steeple standing out amid the neighborhood. Reverend Thomas Whitlow, the pastor in charge, was the most respected man in the area. He had lived in Knoxville for over 30 years, having preached to the parents of the people sitting in the wooden pews today. Whitlow was strict but approachable, with a deep warm voice and kind bright eyes. To many, he was not just a preacher, but a symbol of faith and safety. Elena felt the same. She saw him as a teacher, a spiritual father, often staying to help clean up after services or choir practices. In the first days after her disappearance, people gathered in front of the churchyard, whispering in worry. Some murmured that Elena had probably just gone somewhere for a few days, maybe to Nashville to look for work, since she had once said she wanted to study education. Others said she would never do anything without telling her mother. The police hadn't released any information yet, but rumors began spreading quickly, through every market gathering, every church service. Mrs. Margaret hardly left the house, only receiving visitors' inquiries, and the food they brought to place on the old wooden table. Knoxville, once a place where people still believed nothing bad happens here, now lay under a thin but cold veil of suspicion. In the evenings, the church stayed lit. Reverend Whitlow prayed for Elena at every service, his voice echoing in the quiet space. The townsfolk nodded, holding hands in prayer, trying to believe that God would bring her back. But behind that faith, fear spread silently. The fear that Knoxville was no longer the peaceful town it once was. Every time the sun set, as fog covered Melton Hill Lake, everyone felt an indescribable void, as if from the night that girl vanished, the stillness of this place had changed forever. On Sunday morning, 2 days after Elena disappeared, Knoxville was no longer as peaceful as usual. The bells of Cedar Grove Church rang out through the early mist, but instead of calling the townsfolk to prayer, they seemed like a silent call search. The entire town seemed to wake up with a single purpose. Men drove trucks loaded with flashlights, ropes, and reflective vests. Women brought coffee and pastries for the search teams. The Knox County Sheriff's Department set up a temporary command center right in the churchyard, where a large map of the area was spread out on a wooden table, marked with red pins for places to check. No one thought Elena might have met with foul play. They just wanted to find her, lost, fainted, or simply in need of help. That morning the crowd dispersed into small groups, along the trails around Melton Hill Lake. This was the route Elena usually drove through every Friday evening, a quiet and beautiful road, but also the foggiest spot. The water lay flat as a mirror, reflecting the shadows of people walking along the shore. Bloodhounds were brought in, noses pressed close to the damp, cold ground. Police checked every curve, every clearing, while dive teams scoured the area around the bridge. But the lake was vast and deep, its bottom covered in mud and weeds, nothing but drifting wood scraps and old trash. By noon, the weather warmed up, but the mood in the search groups grew heavy. Everyone was exhausted, yet no one would stop. By afternoon, police received a tip from a resident living near the lake. On Friday night, he'd heard a car engine stop on the road, then go silent. They immediately cordoned off that area. When the patrol car arrived, the fog began to lift, the sun peeking through the tree line. On the narrow road, they spotted a silvery glint amid the weeds, the Chevrolet Nova that belonged to Elena. The car sat about a few dozen meters off the main road, its front wheels sunk slightly into a dirt rut, covered in a thin layer of dew. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition, the seats undisturbed, her purse and handbag missing from inside. Everything looked like it had been left in a hurry, but there were no signs of a struggle or damage. Police strung up yellow tape around the area. Townsfolk gathered along the roadside, whispering, their faces a mix of relief and fear. One said, "At least we found the car." Another replied softly, "But where is she?" The investigative team photographed the scene, collecting soil samples and fibers stuck to the door handle. A forensics officer popped the trunk, finding only a few old books and a cracked music box. No clear leads. As the car was towed back to headquarters, dusk fell, the whole sky turning a deep copper. Margaret, standing a few meters away, clutching her shawl tightly, watched her daughter's car being hauled off without a word. Her neighbor placed a hand on her shoulder, asking softly, "Did they find anything?" She just shook her head. That evening the local radio station announced the disappearance, calling on residents to help out. The number of search volunteers doubled the next day, including college students from the University of Tennessee. Teams split up to comb every forest patch, every lakeside clearing. Flyers with Elena's photo were plastered on every utility pole, bulletin board, and grocery store. Knoxville, the place where people once believed crime only existed in the papers, now held its breath in fear and sympathy. After 3 straight days of searching, police paused the operation. They said they needed to analyze data and wait for forensics results. But for the people of Knoxville, that void couldn't be filled with reasons. That night, the lights in Cedar Grove Church stayed on late. Reverend Whitlow stood on the steps, head bowed low, reading a prayer for the young woman whose whereabouts were still unknown. At the base of the stairs, small candles were lined up in a long row, flickering in the autumn breeze, their glow reflecting off the still lake surface, the place where the whole town believed the answers lay, answers they hadn't yet found. Elena's Chevrolet Nova was brought to the Knox County Sheriff's headquarters the next morning, kicking off the official investigation phase. Detective Samuel Keene, a man in his early 40s, with a weathered face and deep-set eyes that always carried a weary look, was assigned to lead the case. He'd handled plenty of missing persons before, but Elena's struck him as especially troubling. A good girl, no criminal record, no debts, no conflicts with anyone. Cases like that rarely ended well. Keene went back to the scene, reviewing the spot where the car had been found. He examined the faint tire tracks on the damp ground, then gazed out at the distant lake, the morning light making him squint. If someone stopped here, he said to his partner, they picked a spot that's way too quiet. The first report from the tech lab said the car showed no signs of break-in, no blood, no struggle marks, just a few hairs on the seat, and a small scratch on the outside door handle. The samples were sealed and sent to the Tennessee State Forensics Lab. In 1988, DNA tech was still pretty limited, and Keene knew the results wouldn't tell them much. But he believed that sometimes, the tiniest details revealed the heart of the story. He started gathering statements. The first was from Jenny Parker, the best friend who'd rehearsed singing with Elena that night. Jenny recounted it in detail. Practice wrapped up around 9:15. Folks headed out gradually. Elena was the last to leave, carrying her sheet music and handbag. No strangers around the church. Jenny insisted Elena hadn't seemed upset or worried. She was just a little tired, said she'd head home and crash early. Jenny said, her voice choking up. Keene took careful notes, but inside, he wasn't at ease. People who vanished quietly, rarely just went for a walk. The second was Rick Dalton, Elena's ex-boyfriend, who'd split with her 6 months back. Rick was a mechanic out in the suburbs, tall guy with a gravelly voice. When Keene asked what he'd been doing on the night of October 7th, Rick said he'd been home watching football with a buddy. But when Keene pressed for the buddy's name, he hesitated. That shifty glance made Keene take note. After leaving Rick's place, he jotted in his notebook, "Can't rule out someone she knew." Next up was Reverend Thomas Whitlow, the pastor at Cedar Grove Church. He greeted Keene in his office lined with scripture books, voice steady. "I'm heartbroken," he said. "Elena was a good girl. I thought of her like a daughter." He confirmed he'd left the church at 9, hadn't come back after. Keene scanned the room, noticing a group photo of the choir on the wall, Elena front row with a bright smile. Something in the pastor's eyes gave him a mix of trust and wariness, a gut feeling honed by years on the job that he couldn't shake. In the days that followed, police interviewed over 30 people, co-workers from the bookstore, friends, neighbors, passers-by, living around the lake. No one had seen Elena after she left the church. A guy working at the nearby gas station said he'd spotted a silver car creeping by slow, but couldn't swear it was her Nova. Leads as thin as midday fog. Keene returned to the Holloway home. Margaret opened the door, her face gaunt from sleepless nights. He took in the house. Elena's little room still tidy, the vanity holding a framed photo of mother and daughter, an old birthday card, and her guitar leaning in the corner. Nothing suggested she'd planned to leave. "She didn't run off, sir," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "She still owes me dinner." Keene nodded gently, scanned the room once more, made his notes, and left with a heavy feeling. That evening, he stood by his office window, staring through the hazy streetlights. The missing person, Elena Grace Holloway file grew thicker with notes, but still empty on answers. He flipped back to the photo of the car parked by the lake, thinking of the bright eyes of the girl in the choir shot. In the silence, Keene knew this was no ordinary missing person case anymore. Somewhere in this little town, someone was holding a secret, and he'd have to follow the thinnest threads to uncover it. News of Elena Holloway's disappearance spread quickly through Knoxville, seeping into every church service, every family dinner table, every little coffee shop along Cumberland Avenue. On the evening news, the young woman's face appeared with the caption, "Missing since October 7, 1988. The anchor spoke in a somber tone, the background showing Cedar Grove Church bathed in sunset light. Knoxville, once so peaceful that folks left their doors unlocked for afternoon naps, now lay under a thin veil of unease. Everyone prayed, but deep down, everyone felt scared. Scared that something dark had happened right in the town they thought was the safest place on earth." The following Sunday morning, Cedar Grove Church was packed. Candles burned along both sides of the aisle, their small flames flickering on the solemn faces below. Reverend Thomas Whitlow stood at the pulpit, his voice steady through the old speakers. "Let us pray for Elena, for her family and for all our faith." Down front, Margaret sat in the first row, her trembling hands clutching her Bible tight. Folks around her bowed their heads, but their eyes held a flicker of confusion. They prayed out of sympathy, but they also prayed out of fear, because if this could happen to Elena, it could happen to anyone. Outside, the kids no longer gathered to play in the yard. Women started locking doors early. Men in the neighborhood took turns patrolling at night. Porch lights stayed on all night like little torches, clinging to a fragile sense of safety. At the station, Detective Keene kept grinding away at the file, but no new leads surfaced. The forensics report from Nashville came back curt. insufficient samples for analysis, a cold line that slammed shut any slim hopes. Rumors started creeping in. Some said Elena had been snatched by a stranger while driving by the lake. Others whispered she'd run off with a lover, or gotten tangled in something shady. Each rumor sliced like a small knife into the town's trust. Jenny Parker tried defending her friend, telling folks Elena would never do that, but made-up stories spread faster than the truth. And soon the name Elena Holloway wasn't just a symbol of a sweet girl anymore, it was a reminder of the growing fear in people's hearts. Margaret clung to hope. Every night, she lit a small candle on the windowsill, so its light could guide her daughter home. She went to church daily, praying at the altar, sometimes just sitting silent, saying nothing. Reverend Whitlow often stood nearby, quietly placing a hand on her shoulder, offering words of comfort. For Margaret, the church was the only place left with a shred of peace, but for others, the pastor's silence started raising questions. One evening, when Keene stopped by to update Margaret, he saw the half-burned candles, their golden light casting on the weary mother's face. "Do you believe she's still alive?" she asked. Keene paused a few seconds, then said slowly, "I believe in the truth, ma'am, and sometimes the truth takes time to come out." The answer comforted no one, but it was all he could say. As fall edged into winter, Knoxville sank into damp chill. Every time thick fog blanketed Melton Hill Lake, folks remembered the girl who vanished without a trace. The church still echoed with prayers, but faith and fear now intertwined, blending into something no one could pull apart. And in that silence, it felt like something was waiting to be found, or buried forever under Knoxville's heavy fog. 3 weeks had passed since Elena disappeared. Knoxville had grown accustomed to that heavy feeling like an endless rain. People mentioned her name every day, but no one hoped to see her walk through the church doors anymore. Autumn was drawing to a close, the fog over Melton Hill Lake so thick it obscured the far shore. That morning, a man named Harold Boyd, a dock maintenance worker, patrolled the lake's edge as usual. As he bent down to fish out a drifting log, he spotted something caught in the reeds, a piece of dark green fabric. He pulled it up, and realized it was a woman's sweater, the collar still attached with a loose pearl button. The sweater was caked in mud, and flecked with a few long strands of brown hair. The initials, EGH, were embroidered small inside the collar in white thread. Harold froze. He'd heard Elena's name too many times over the past few weeks, and seeing those 3 letters, he knew he'd found something he couldn't ignore. The police were called shortly after. Detective Keene arrived at the scene, the wind whipping so hard he had to hunch as he stepped through the wet grass. The sweater was carefully placed in a sealed bag, droplets of water still dripping from the hem onto the ground. Keene donned gloves, examined every detail closely, then turned toward the lake. The water was still as glass, reflecting the ash-gray sky. "If this is her sweater," he said softly, "then Elena was very close to this spot." He ordered a search of a 2-mile radius around the discovery site. The dive team was mobilized again, equipped with rudimentary sonar scanners, the new kind recently outfitted by the state police. They searched all day but found nothing but rocks, trash, and a few broken branches. The forensics lab received the evidence that afternoon. The sweater was dried and examined meticulously. Under the microscope, the technician spotted a small fleck of metallic silver paint on the cuff, possibly from a car door. A few hairs were collected for analysis, but since DNA testing wasn't widespread, they could only compare color and length. The report came back to Keene 2 days later. Hairs matched the victim's description. No blood or cuts from sharp objects detected. In other words, the sweater revealed nothing about what had happened. It only proved that Elena had been here, and perhaps had gotten out of the car. News of the discovery spread quickly. That evening, the local station replayed footage of the lake shore, the sweater wrapped in a nylon bag, officers standing guard in the cold wind. Knoxville residents gathered to pray again. Reverend Whitlow stood at the pulpit, speaking of God's signs and a light of hope in the darkness. But in everyone's hearts, that sweater was no longer hope. It was proof that Elena might have met something terrible. Margaret Holloway received photos of the sweater from the police. She stared at them for a long time, then nodded, tears falling silently. "I knitted it last winter," she said. She said this color made her look more grown-up. Keene stood nearby, silent. He could sense something in that voice, not despair, but the cold acceptance of a mother, beginning to understand that no miracle would come. The green sweater was stored in a brown paper envelope, labeled Evidence A17. Keene added a note to the file. "Item found at Melton Hill likely belonging to the victim. The investigation continued. As he closed the file folder, night had fallen, the wind from the lake carrying a skin-cutting chill. Under the dim moonlight, the water remained eerily flat, as if hiding an answer no one wanted to hear. Early in 1989, the file on Elena Holloway's disappearance had thickened by hundreds of pages, but showed no progress. Everything revolved around the green sweater found by Melton Hill Lake, the only clue, and the last one. No witnesses, no new evidence, no credible statements. After nearly 4 months of investigation, the Knox County Police were forced to narrow the scope, shelving the case in the pending category. In the final report, Detective Samuel Keene wrote simply, "No progress. Victim survival undetermined." To him, it wasn't just procedure, it was a bitter admission of failure. As winter thawed, Knoxville gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Church meetings no longer mentioned Elena's name. The missing Elena Grace Holloway poster hung at the Cedar Grove gate faded in the sun and rain, the corners curling, the word reward nearly illegible. Reverend Thomas Whitlow continued preaching as if nothing had happened, his voice still warm and steady. The Lord has reasons for every loss, but among the congregation, faith had begun to waver. Margaret Holloway was the only one who hadn't given up. Every week she visited the police station for updates, and each time received the familiar reply, "We're still following leads." She wrote letters to TV stations, sent her daughter's photos to newspapers, called relief organizations in Nashville, even Atlanta, but no one responded. Time replaced Elena's case with new stories: a robbery, a fire, a car accident. Her name lingered only in the memory of a few. Detective Keene was transferred to another division, but kept a copy of the file in his personal drawer. Sometimes, on late nights, he'd flip through the pages, rereading Jenny Parker's statement, Reverend Whitlow's, Margaret's. He still remembered the chill of the night he found the sweater by the lake, and the elderly mother's gaze down at the water. Even though the case was filed as Cold Case #1988-1127, Keene never saw it as the past. In his mind, the question echoed, where did Elena go, and why? Knoxville gradually forgot. Jenny Parker moved to Memphis for college, carrying a photo of them together in the choir. Reverend Whitlow remained respected, his sermons drawing even larger crowds, but whenever they saw the empty seat in the choir, a few bowed their heads. No one dared speak the name of the girl who had vanished. Margaret Holloway aged quickly. Every evening, she lit a small candle on the windowsill, its flickering flame casting light on her daughter's photo. The wooden house on Cedar Grove Street always smelled of candle wax and dried daisies. Neighbors stopped asking, but every night they saw the lone yellow light in that house, a sign the mother was still waiting. In December 1989, the police officially closed the file. The local station's announcement was a single line: no new developments in the disappearance of Elena Grace Holloway. Police will reopen if additional information arises. Then her name vanished from the news, the papers, everyday conversations. Knoxville returned to its peaceful rhythm, but on the west side of town, Melton Hill Lake remained as silent as if no one had ever called Elena's name there. Whenever the wind rippled the surface, the waves reflected the distant church lights, like a lingering whisper from the young woman the whole town thought it had forgotten. The 1990s passed quietly, dragging away the last fragile hopes of those who once believed Elena Holloway would return. Knoxville entered a time of change, factories rising, new roads opening, old neighborhoods replaced by supermarkets and gas stations. But in the small corner of Cedar Grove Street, Margaret Holloway's wooden house still stood, as if trapped in another time. The windows still glowed each night with the small candle, and inside, Elena's photo remained neatly placed on the table, the wooden frame darkening with the years. 32, then 40, then 50. If she were alive, Elena would now be a grown woman, but in her mother's memory, she remained forever the 22-year-old, in the blue dress from her last choir rehearsal. Detective Samuel Keene had retired. He lived in a small house on the south side suburbs, often sitting on the porch during rainy days, rereading the old file. He still kept the thick stack of Elena's case documents in an iron box, the pages yellowing at the edges. Every time he saw the words Cold Case #1988-1127, he felt a part of his conscience that had never rested. Keene knew he'd done everything possible back then, but he also understood that justice sometimes stays silent for a lifetime. That case, to him, was an unfillable void, a voice that never quieted in his head, whenever he passed Melton Hill Lake. To the Knoxville community, the disappearance gradually became a story retold on rainy evenings, a sad legend about the young woman who vanished without a trace. Children growing up in the town heard their parents recount it, even calling the lakeside road Elena's Path. Reverend Thomas Whitlow, now in his 60s, still preached regularly at Cedar Grove. He was the only one who still mentioned Elena in his Sunday prayers, though that voice grew fainter. In people's eyes, he was a symbol of steadfast faith, the man who never stopped believing in a miracle, even if he himself no longer knew if it would come. Jenny Parker, Elena's best friend, left Knoxville for school and started a family in Memphis. Sometimes, driving back to visit, she'd pass the lake, pull over for a moment, and gaze at the still water. Once she brought a bunch of white daisies, tossed them onto the surface, and whispered, "If you're out there somewhere, I hope you see this." But like so many others, Jenny gradually accepted that the silence was the only answer. Margaret aged quickly. She no longer wrote to the police or TV stations, just kept the old newspapers in a tin box under the bed. Occasionally, Reverend Whitlow visited, bringing food and praying with her. "The Lord has His own time," he said, and she nodded, though her eyes held no spark of hope, only weariness. For her faith was no longer waiting for a miracle, but learning to live with the pain without resentment. Then the 2000s arrived. Technology advanced. People talked a lot about DNA, about old cases cracked by new science. Some advised her to contact the police again, but Margaret just gave a sad smile. They don't remember anymore. The town of Knoxville kept changing, but Melton Hill Lake stayed the same, serene still, and seemingly untouched by time. In 2012, Margaret Holloway passed away in her sleep at 78. She was buried next to the empty plot by Cedar Grove Church, where she'd prayed for her daughter for so many years. On her gravestone, a simple inscription, "A mother who waited and believed." And somewhere, in the twilight shadows of Knoxville, the lake's surface remained as flat as a mirror of memory, reflecting the long years of futility the whole town had endured. 32 years later, in the fall of 2020, Knoxville welcomed another light rain. In the Knox County Sheriff's Office headquarters, young Sergeant Dana Morales was assigned the task of reviewing unsolved case files for the newly formed Cold Case Review Unit. Amid stacks of yellow documents, she paused at a file labeled #1988-1127, Elena Grace Holloway. Inside was a black and white photo of the young girl with a gentle smile, a handwritten note, "Missing after choir practice." Dana sat silently for a moment. A disappearance lasting over 3 decades, a face never found. She knew she wanted to reopen this file first. The next day, Dana presented her proposal to her superiors. The approval order was signed quickly because the unit had just received support from the state of Tennessee to apply forensic genealogy technology, tracing DNA through genealogical databases, a method that had helped solve many old cases. She reviewed the evidence inventory in the file and paused at the line, "Evidence A17, blue knitted sweater." A small specimen, but it could be the key. Dana contacted the storage facility and was surprised to find the sweater still intact in a brown paper envelope, sealed since 1988. She immediately sent it to the forensics lab to rescan the DNA sample with new technology. While waiting for the results, Dana read every page of the old reports. Amid the typed lines, she came across many handwritten notes from Detective Samuel Keene, who had once handled the case. Short lines, "If I'd had a little more time, I would have found her." His name was still on the department's retirement list, now 74 years old, living in the suburbs of Knoxville. Dana decided to meet him. Keene's small house nestled by the woods, its porch covered in moss. When he heard Elena's name, he fell silent for a moment before inviting her in. On the shelf, the old file was still kept intact in an iron box. "I didn't think anyone remembered her anymore," he said, his voice hoarse. "If you're reopening it, I'll help." They reviewed the crime scene map, photos of the Chevrolet Nova by the lake, and statements from witnesses from back then. When Reverend Thomas Whitlow, the pastor of Cedar Grove Church, was mentioned, Keene just stayed quiet. "Did you suspect him?" Dana asked. He only replied, "I once thought everyone around the church could be the key, but I didn't have enough evidence." A week later, the results came back from the forensics lab. From the sweater's cuff, they isolated a clear male DNA sample, something impossible in 1988. The data was uploaded to the genetic genealogy database, where millions of Americans had voluntarily provided DNA samples to trace relatives. With modern technology, Elena's case had a chance to be illuminated for the first time in over 30 years. That night, the office was lit only by the glow from the computer screen. Dana watched the notification appear: sample upload complete, processing. Rain still fell outside the window, heavy drops falling like the rhythm of time that had stood still for 3 decades. In that moment, she understood she was standing on the boundary between past and present, between buried secrets and truth about to rise. After 32 years, Elena Holloway's disappearance was officially reopened, and this time, Knoxville would have to face the answers it had once tried to forget. 3 weeks after the sample was uploaded to the system, the results from the Tennessee State DNA Analysis Lab stunned the entire cold case unit. The male DNA recovered from Elena's sweater cuff didn't match any criminal records, but it had a close genetic link to the Whitlow family in Tennessee, matching the surname of Reverend Thomas Whitlow, the pastor of Cedar Grove Church. When that name appeared on the screen, Sergeant Dana Morales fell silent. An unbelievable coincidence, since this man had been a central figure in the 1988 file. She immediately called Detective Samuel Keene, who had once handled the case. Upon hearing the news, he was silent for a long time before softly replying, "I always felt there was something about him." Keene recounted that Whitlow was the first to organize prayers for Elena, and the last to see her at choir practice. But that year, he had no evidence to suspect him. "In that town, everyone saw Whitlow as a saint," he said. Dana nodded. "Now we have reason to ask the questions again." The two began collaborating once more. Dana searched civil records, confirming Whitlow still lived in Knoxville, retired since 2012, but occasionally still preaching. She obtained a soft surveillance warrant, and quietly gathered information. In a few days, they had a familiar picture: a 73-year-old man living alone in a red brick house near the church. No criminal record, regular charitable activities. Everything perfect to the point of being unbelievable. One October afternoon, Dana and Keene visited Whitlow, under the pretext of re-interviewing old witnesses. The small house was quiet. The door opened, and Whitlow appeared, tall and thin, silver hair, gentle eyes. When Elena's name came up, he hesitated slightly, then smiled. "That girl. It's been a long time since anyone mentioned her." He invited them into the living room, walls hung with photos of services, including one of Elena standing in the front row, her smile pure. His voice was steady, speaking of faith and loss. Keene observed closely, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes evasive when 1988 was mentioned. Nothing overt, but the excessive calm made him uneasy. Leaving the house, Dana submitted a request to collect a DNA sample from Whitlow, under the pretext of assisting in identity verification. He refused, citing privacy rights and health. This was the reaction Dana had anticipated. Instead of forcing it, she shifted direction, scanning Whitlow relatives in the area. In the records, she found a standout name: Caleb Whitlow, the pastor's nephew, who had lived in Knoxville in the 1980s, left right after Elena's disappearance, and died in 2005 in a car accident in Memphis. Dana tracked down medical records, and obtained a stored DNA sample from the hospital. The comparison results made the entire investigation room hold its breath. 98.7% similarity, confirming the DNA found on Elena's sweater belonged to someone in direct blood relation to Reverend Whitlow. Both Dana and Keene stared silently at the report with that number in bold. 32 years had passed, and finally they had a real connection. Whitlow might not be directly involved, Dana said slowly, but clearly someone in his family was very close to Elena that night. Keene nodded, his eyes darkening. "We've just opened a door, but it might also be a wound." That night, Dana sat alone in the office, the case file spread out on the desk. She looked out the window, Knoxville shrouded in fog, the lights from the old church casting onto the sky like a reminder from the past. On the computer screen, the DNA results still glowed with the line, match 98.7%. 32 years of silence had now dissolved. The tiny traces, left on the old sweater, were forcing the whole town to confront a truth it had once denied. The keeper of the secret about Elena Holloway might never have been far away, still living right among them, under the guise of faith and light. The DNA connection discovery prompted Sergeant Dana Morales to return to the starting point of it all: Cedar Grove Baptist Church, where Elena vanished after choir practice in 1988. The building still stood there, among ancient oak trees, its red brick darkened by time, the bell tower casting a shadow over the cobblestone path. Though closed since Reverend Whitlow's retirement, the church was maintained by the community as a religious relic. Stepping through the heavy wooden door, Dana caught the scent of dampness mixed with aged wood, the characteristic air of places that once held faith and prayers now faded. She and Detective Keene walked down the hallway, dim light from the stained glass windows casting onto the mottled walls. Everything was almost unchanged from the photos in the old file that Keene had taken more than 30 years ago. "Every brick here knows what happened," he said softly. They moved to the back area, once the choir practice room. Dust covered the tables and chairs, but Dana still recognized the old organ, a few wooden plaques listing choir members. On one, the words Elena Holloway remained. The paint faded silver with the years. They began searching the church's rear structure, the storage area and basement. According to 1976 building records, this area had a small storage cellar, sealed after the 1990 flood. Dana obtained permission from local authorities for an inspection under the pretext of structural safety. When the technical team arrived, they discovered the basement entrance, hidden behind a large wooden panel, painted to match the wall, nearly invisible. Below, wooden stairs led to a narrow, damp space. Flashlights swept through, the beam illuminating mold streaks and thick cobwebs. In the corner, Dana spotted a few old wooden crates and a rusted metal chest, its lock broken long ago. When they opened it, inside were a few black and white photos of the choir, some handwritten letters, an old Bible, and an item that made Dana freeze, a small necklace engraved with EGH. Dust dulled it, but the letters were still clear. She put on gloves and placed the item in an evidence bag. Keene stared at it for a long time, then said softly, "It can't be a coincidence." In the cold, damp space, both felt the same thing. They had just touched a remnant of the story. Knoxville had tried to forget. Dana had the area cordoned off and called in the forensics team to rescan the entire basement. On the wall, they found a section of cement with an old patch, a different color from the rest. Dust samples were taken for testing, but it would take time to analyze. Outside, Keene looked up at the old bell tower, afternoon sunlight, filtering through the door cracks, casting gold light on the distant lake. "This place used to be a sanctuary," he said, "but maybe it was also where people hid what they feared most." As they left the church, Dana looked back at the building one more time, a mix of sacred and heavy feeling intertwined. She knew today's discovery could be the biggest breakthrough in the case, but it might also stir up secrets many didn't want to remember. In the car, Keene was silent, his hand gripping the file tightly. "If Whitlow knew this existed," he said, "he's had 30 years to hide it." Dana nodded, her eyes still on the rearview mirror, the image of Cedar Grove Church shrinking in the twilight, like a shadow of the past not yet ready to release the truth it had kept for 3 decades. 2 days after the forensics team sealed off the basement of Cedar Grove Church, the preliminary report landed on Sergeant Dana Morales's desk. Dust samples from the irregular concrete wall section showed traces of coal ash and partially burned organic matter, not a typical patch job. The results were enough to secure a warrant for an expanded examination of the entire area. In the early morning of March 17, 2021, Knox County Police, along with the crime scene investigation team, returned to the old church, cordoning off the surroundings. Spring winds carrying cold dampness blew through the rows of oak trees, the creaking of the rusted bell tower in the wind sounding like the sigh of the past. Dana descended the wooden stairs leading to the basement, where the light from the lamps illuminated each speck of dust floating in the air. The space was deathly silent, save for the echoing whir of the drill. When the wall section was drilled open, chunks of concrete flaked away, revealing a small hollow space behind it. Everyone held their breath. One of the technicians shone a flashlight inside. It was a wall niche about half a meter deep, containing an old tin box with a rusted lid and sides caked in dry mud. Dana slipped on gloves and carefully lifted it out. The people gathered around said nothing, just watched as she opened the lid. Inside was a collection of small items wrapped in old nylon bags, a few letters, a pocket Bible, a broken necklace chain, and one object that silenced the entire room. A photo of Elena Holloway taken with Reverend Whitlow and the choir, the top right corner torn off, leaving only the girl's smiling face. Dana looked at Keene, and he just gave a slight nod, as if confirming what neither of them wanted to believe. She flipped through the contents below, and found a small yellowed folded piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky. "Forgive me, for I could not protect her. The river took her before I could." No signature, but the script matched Reverend Whitlow's handwriting in the church registration records. There was no doubt now. Someone had tried to hide a piece of the story here. As the forensics team continued examining the area, they discovered additional small burn marks scattered along the concrete floor. One specialist speculated that someone had burned something right there on the spot, and then patched it over with cement. Beneath the layer of dust, they also collected shards of broken glass from a picture frame, and a few strands of dark fabric. Each piece of evidence was numbered and placed in its own bag. In the dim light, Dana sensed a heavy atmosphere, as if a place once filled with song now echoed only with the sighs of sin. Upstairs in the yard, Keene called to request an emergency arrest warrant. He'd waited 32 years for this moment. When the police knocked on Reverend Whitlow's door, the elderly pastor stepped out, his face serene. "I guess you've found something," he said, his voice strangely light. Dana looked at him, not angry, just seeing in those eyes something like exhaustion that had dragged on too long. "We need you to come with us," she said. That afternoon, the news spread throughout Knoxville. Police arrest pastor in connection with 1988 disappearance case. The whole town was stunned. In front of the old church gates, residents gathered, faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Everyone had once heard Whitlow's sermons, called him a symbol of faith, and now they had to face a truth no one dared imagine. At headquarters, Whitlow remained silent throughout the interrogation. When asked about the basement, he only said curtly, "I'm not hiding sin, I'm just hiding memories." That statement sent a chill down Dana's spine. She didn't know if he was talking about his own sins or someone else's, but clearly, what they'd found in the basement was just the beginning. Inside that old tin box, along with the torn photo and the vague confessional note, there were probably many things that Cedar Grove Church and all of Knoxville weren't ready to hear. The news of Pastor Thomas Whitlow's arrest spread throughout Knoxville in just one night, faster than the damp winds blowing over Melton Hill Lake. Local papers ran it on the front page. Former Cedar Grove Church pastor arrested in 1988 disappearance case. The whole town was in shock. People who once sat in the front pews, listening to him preach about faith, no longer knew what to believe. The next morning, the churchyard was packed. On one side were old parishioners carrying candles, crying and praying, believing he was misunderstood. On the other were the angry ones, feeling betrayed, saying that for 30 years they'd worshipped a man who carried guilt. The iron fence around the church became a boundary between two opposing faiths. Reverend Whitlow was escorted into the police car on that chilly morning, wearing an old gray sweater, his eyes vacant. When reporters asked if he had anything to say, he only replied softly, "Only the Lord knows the full truth." That statement only deepened the public's division. On social media, debates raged fiercely, sharing images of the tin box, the old photo of Elena with its torn corner. Many couldn't believe the gentle pastor could be involved in the death of the girl he'd once called a lamb of the faith, but others said that his perfection all these years had been the mask he'd worn too long. Sergeant Dana Morales and retired Detective Samuel Keene were ordered to limit statements. They stayed silent amid the media storm, knowing that the upcoming forensic results would be the only key to ending the controversy. In her office, Dana read each article with a heavy heart. She knew this case wasn't just about one disappearance, it had touched the deepest faith of the entire community. Keene was more cautious. "The public will forgive a sinner," he said, "but they'll never forgive the one who made them believe wrong." That evening, in front of Cedar Grove Church, residents lit candles. The small flames flickered in the wind, reflecting off the still lake surface. An elderly woman whispered, "30 years ago, we prayed to find the girl. Today we're praying to find the truth." In that heavy atmosphere, Knoxville was no longer the peaceful town it once was. Faith was cracked, memories thought long dormant had awakened, and Elena Holloway's name echoed everywhere again, like a reminder that no sin, no matter how deeply buried, can hide from the light forever. In the small interrogation room at the Knox County Sheriff's Office, the air was thick. The white light cast down on the gaunt face of Reverend Thomas Whitlow, the man once revered by all of Knoxville, now sitting quietly before two investigators. On the table, the tin box found in the basement sat in the center, like a symbol of an undeniable past. Sergeant Dana Morales looked at him, her voice steady. "We have the evidence. DNA, letters, photos. Do you have anything to say?" Whitlow was silent for a long time, his hands clasped tightly, head slightly bowed as if in prayer. Then he spoke softly, his voice hoarse and weary. "I didn't kill her, but I can't say I'm innocent." Dana and retired Detective Samuel Keene exchanged glances. Keene leaned forward, his voice low. "Spell it out, Reverend. You owe that girl, and this whole town, an explanation." Whitlow raised his head, his eyes cloudy but calm, and began to recount, his voice trembling as if confessing in his own church. "That night, Elena came to see me after choir practice. She was crying, saying she couldn't stay home anymore. She said her stepfather beat her regularly, and her mother stayed silent. I promised to help her leave Knoxville, at least temporarily. I thought I was doing the right thing." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I told her I knew someone who could take her to Jackson that night, but it had to be kept secret, not to tell anyone, not even her mother." According to Whitlow, on the night of October 7, 1988, he took Elena to a clearing near Melton Hill Lake, where the Chevrolet Nova was later found. A young man was waiting in a pickup truck, introducing himself as Caleb Whitlow, his nephew, then just over 20. "I trusted him," Whitlow said quietly, "because he was blood." He recounted that Elena got into Caleb's truck, carrying a small bag, waving goodbye to him before the vehicle drove off. That was the last time he saw her. "I didn't know where he took her. The next morning, I went looking, but he had vanished from Knoxville. A week later, when I heard about the sweater by the lake, I knew something had gone wrong." Dana gripped her pen tightly, asking, "Why didn't you report it to the police?" Whitlow closed his eyes, shaking his head slightly. "I was a pastor, a representative of the Lord. If I spoke up, I'd be seen as the one who helped her run away, an accomplice. I was afraid, and I chose silence. When Caleb died in the accident in 2005, I saw it as the Lord's punishment for him, and for me." He stopped, his gaze distant. "I'm not hiding guilt, just my shame." Keene leaned back in his chair, his voice heavy. "What about the necklace, the photo and the paper in the tin box?" Whitlow replied, "I kept them as evidence for my prayers. I meant to confess long ago, but every time I looked at Elena's picture, I couldn't. I thought if the church still stood, her soul would rest in peace." Dana asked further, "The burn marks in the basement, what did you burn?" He looked straight at her. "I burned Caleb's letters. In them he wrote that things got out of hand. I couldn't bear reading it, so I buried the fire with my sins." Silence stretched on. Dana looked at the man before her, not a monster anymore, but an old priest collapsed under his own faith. She noted every word, knowing this confession wouldn't close the case, but it was enough to bring light back. When the recording session ended, Whitlow leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, murmuring softly, "I've preached about salvation my whole life, but maybe the one who needed saving most was me." That evening, a special news bulletin aired on local TV. Reverend Thomas Whitlow admits to helping Elena Holloway leave Knoxville in 1988, denies murder. The news sparked controversy everywhere, but for Dana and Keene, they knew the case had turned to its final chapter. The truth, though not complete, had finally emerged after 32 years of burial, and in the shadowed corner of Cedar Grove Church, once a symbol of faith, there lingered only the echo of a belated confession, one that was both redemptive and punitive. After Reverend Whitlow's confession, the investigation was far from over. Sergeant Dana Morales understood that gaps still remained in the story he had told. Many details were vague, especially the part where he said Elena left with Caleb and never came back. That evening, while reviewing the files, Dana noticed a forgotten note, silver pickup truck registered in Monroe County. She checked the Tennessee State Archives and discovered that Caleb Whitlow, the pastor's nephew, had once had an address in Monroe County, about an hour's drive from Knoxville. If Whitlow's words were true, Elena had very likely taken that road before disappearing. The next morning, Dana went to see Detective Keene. He was sitting on the front porch, still carrying his familiar somber demeanor. When she explained, he nodded. If Caleb headed toward Monroe, maybe an accident or some clue was overlooked. The two set out that same day. The road to Monroe wound through hills and spring oak forests. At the local courthouse, they found an old accident report from October 1988. A small pickup truck had gone off a hillside near Highway 68, with the driver's identity unknown. The case had been ruled a single-vehicle accident due to loss of control. They drove to the scene described in the file. After more than 30 years, the place was almost unchanged. The forest denser, the road narrower, the old landslide covered in green moss. Keene stopped the car, looked around, and said softly, "If this is the spot, she might still be here." They made their way down the slope, flashlight beams sweeping over the damp soil. Under tree roots, Dana spotted something glinting, a rusted piece of silver metal. When she picked it up, she realized it was part of a truck door frame, the silver paint matching the description in the 1988 file. They called in the technical team for excavation. By afternoon, as the landslide soil was cleared away, the entire truck frame emerged, shattered and buried nearly 2 meters deep. Inside, the forensics team found 2 human skeletons, one male, one female. Dana stood silently watching, her heart heavy. She didn't need to wait for results to know what they had found. Later analysis confirmed, the female skeleton matched Elena Holloway, and the male was Caleb Whitlow. But the collision analysis showed the truck had been hit from behind, not a simple accident. Someone had forced it off the road. That evening, Dana and Keene returned to Knoxville to report the findings. Reverend Whitlow listened, silent for a long time, then only said, "The Lord has brought her back." But Dana didn't believe the story ended with the Lord's will. She sent a paint sample from the truck at the scene to the lab. 2 days later, the report confirmed the paint matched a 1987 Ford F-150, the same model Reverend Whitlow had owned at the time of Elena's disappearance. When Dana handed the results to Keene, he just sighed. Maybe he wasn't lying, just not telling the whole truth. They sat quietly in the car, looking out at the old Cedar Grove Church, sinking into dusk. The steeple still stood there, silent as a witness to sin. Dana said softly, "Maybe he followed them. Maybe he just wanted to keep Elena back, but things got out of control." Keene didn't respond, his gaze drifting far toward Melton Hill Lake, where the story had begun. As night fell over Knoxville, fog blanketed the water's surface, lights reflecting shimmeringly. Dana knew the case had finally closed, not by verdict, but by truth. Elena hadn't been killed out of hatred, but because of a misguided promise, a misplaced faith. And deep down, she understood, no sin stays buried forever. Only the people who try to keep it that way, on the fragile boundary between faith and darkness. 3 weeks after excavating the truck, the DNA analysis results from the Tennessee State Lab were officially sent to the Knox County Sheriff's Office. Sergeant Dana Morales received the thick sealed envelope, marked Forensic Report, Case Holloway 1988. She opened it slowly, each page rustling in the quiet room. The report affirmed that the DNA evidence from the 2 sets of remains fully matched the archived profiles of Elena Grace Holloway and Caleb Whitlow. No doubt remained, they had died together in that fateful night in 1988. But what caught Dana's attention wasn't the identity results, but the final detail. In the cab, skin and blood samples, mixed in the impact marks on the door didn't belong to either victim, but matched Thomas Whitlow, the pastor of Cedar Grove Church. Dana set the report down, her heart pounding. The DNA evidence shattered the last remnants of ambiguity. Reverend Whitlow hadn't just happened to be there, he had been in the truck or touched the scene at the time of the accident. She immediately called Detective Keene. When he heard, he was silent for a long time, then said softly, "I knew he was hiding something, but not to this extent." The two decided to go to the jail to see Whitlow again. In the interrogation room, the elderly pastor looked gaunt, his silver hair disheveled and skin wrinkled by time. Dana placed the report on the table, flipping to the last page, her voice firm. "We have your DNA in the truck. Can you explain why?" Whitlow stared at the paper for a long moment, then gave a sad little smile. "Because I was there," he said, "but not to kill anyone. I tried to save them." He explained that when Caleb left the church with Elena, he discovered his nephew was drunk. Fearing the outing would cause a scandal, he drove after them, intending to stop them. "I just wanted the girl to stop," I yelled, "but their truck didn't stop. I swerved right to block the front, but the road was narrow, and I clipped them." His voice choked. "The truck lost control, went off the hillside. I ran down, called out, but got no answer. When I saw smoke rising, I knew it was too late." Keene asked, "Why didn't you call the police?" Whitlow closed his eyes briefly. "I'm a man of God. I couldn't let the town know I was the reason the girl everyone was praying for died by my hand. I buried it all, thinking the Lord would forgive." Dana stayed silent, watching the man trembling before her, not a pastor anymore, but someone who had lived half his life in his own sin. When the interrogation ended, Whitlow was charged with involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. The news spread quickly through Knoxville, once again dividing the town, sinner or repentant old man. But for Dana, the case closed in the coldest way, no murderer in the shadows, just a chain of mistakes, fear and silence that stretched 32 years. That afternoon, she stood by Melton Hill Lake, where Elena's sweater had once been found. The water reflected a blood-red sunset, eerily peaceful. In her hand was the final report, the paper that closed the case Knoxville had lived with for over 3 decades. A piece of the truth had finally been uncovered, but the price was the faith of an entire community. On an autumn morning in 2021, Knoxville was shrouded in thin fog as the bells of Cedar Grove Church rang for the first time in over 3 decades. Today wasn't a Sunday service, but a funeral for Elena Grace Holloway, the girl who vanished in 1988, now being laid to rest beside her mother in the town cemetery. In the front row, Sergeant Dana Morales and retired Detective Samuel Keene sat quietly, witnessing the moment they had only seen in cold files for so many years. Elderly townsfolk, faces that had once prayed for Elena in their youth, now gray-haired, still came. Someone held an old photo of her in her choir uniform, her youthful smile seeming to glow amid the gray sky. The casket was covered in white flowers. A young priest from another church officiated, since Reverend Whitlow, the man who once stood at this altar, was now in jail awaiting trial. His absence was a void everyone felt, but no one dared mention. As the priest began reading the prayers, wind rustled through the oak trees, scattering petals lightly onto the ground, like a farewell. Keene bowed his head, his aged eyes weary. He had seen dozens of cases end, but none left him with such profound sadness, a conclusion with no villains, just people burdened by their silence. When the service ended, Dana stepped forward, to place her hand on the casket, whispering, "Finally you've come home." She didn't believe in religious rituals, but she believed Elena's soul, the girl once forgotten in dusty files, now had a place to rest. The press was everywhere, but no one made a fuss. No one asked about Reverend Whitlow anymore. The sensational headlines had stopped, giving way to silence. The Knoxville community had changed too. People no longer debated right and wrong, only felt sorrow for a generation that had lived too long with lies in the name of faith. In a far corner, Mrs. Holloway, Elena's elderly mother, sat in a wheelchair, her eyes cloudy. She had been brought from the nursing home, and seemed to recognize no one. As the prayers rose, she suddenly gripped the nurse's hand and murmured, "The girl, she's home now, isn't she?" No one answered, but everyone understood it was the last word she had for the daughter she had waited for over 33 years. That afternoon, as the sun set, the cemetery sank into pale gold light. Dana and Keene were the last to leave. They stood looking at the new grave, the headstone engraved with simple words, Elena Grace Holloway, 1970, 1988. Finally, the light has found you. Wind blew through, carrying the scent of dry grass and the distant tolling of church bells. Dana said softly, 33 years for one truth. Maybe justice never comes on time, but at least it came. Keene nodded, his eyes distant toward Melton Hill Lake, where the story began and ended. The sky was dyed amber, reflecting on the still water. In that moment, Knoxville seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, not because justice had triumphed, but because finally a soul rested in peace, and a town had dared to face its own darkness. After Elena's funeral, Knoxville entered days of an unusually subdued hush. The whole town seemed to have just awakened from a 33-year-long trance, carrying the aftershocks of a truth no one wanted to face. The Cedar Grove Church still stood there, but now it was sealed off with yellow police tape. On the stone steps, people left flowers, photos, and handwritten notes, prayers for Elena, for Pastor Whitlow, for the town itself. No one argued anymore whether he was a sinner or a victim. Everyone just talked about the silence, the thing that had killed more than the accident on that night in 1988. National media swarmed into Knoxville, calling it the case of shattered faith. Commentary pieces in the press talked about how a small community could hide the truth just because they feared losing the sacred image they worshipped. Many in the town felt ashamed, but others saw it as an opportunity for change. A special committee was formed to oversee the activities of local religious organizations, demanding transparency and periodic psychological evaluations for spiritual leaders. At town hall meetings, residents spoke about building a small memorial for the victims of the case, not just for Elena, but for all those forgotten in the past. For Sergeant Dana Morales, the aftershocks weren't just the media attention, but the emptiness she felt after the case closed. She had lived with it for months, clinging to every detail, every clue. Now that everything was wrapped up, she realized she no longer knew what to do with the silence that remained. In her office, the crime scene photos had been put away, but she still kept the necklace engraved with EG in her desk drawer. Every time she touched it, she remembered Elena's eyes in the old photo, innocent yet strong. Detective Samuel Keene was different. He retired after the case, skipping press conferences, refusing interviews. He left only a letter for Dana. "We can't change the past, but we can keep it from repeating. The truth doesn't need to be celebrated, it just needs to be remembered." Dana read the letter in silence, folded it carefully, and placed it next to the case file, considering it the final word from the man who had spent half his life chasing justice. Meanwhile, in the Knox County Jail, Reverend Whitlow awaited his trial. His health was deteriorating, and the doctor said he had only a few months left. When reporters asked if he had any message, he simply replied, "I spent my whole life teaching others to believe in God, but I myself feared the truth more than anyone." That quote was published everywhere, becoming a bitter symbol for the case. That winter, snow fell earlier than usual. By Melton Hill Lake, where Elena's sweater had once been found, residents erected a small cross with a wooden sign carved with the words, "Sometimes justice isn't punishment, but daring to admit mistakes." On Christmas night, hundreds gathered there to light candles. The light reflected on the calm lake surface, blending into the cold mist. Dana stood at the back row, holding the small necklace in her hand. She knew the Holloway case would be talked about for years to come, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. Knoxville would go on living, but it would never forget this winter. The winter when the whole town was forced to look straight into its own darkness, to find the sliver of light left in faith. The following spring, Knoxville gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The small streets around Melton Hill Lake bustled with people again. Kids rode bikes along the sidewalks, and the bell of Cedar Grove Church, after a long silence, rang out once more on a warm Sunday morning. The church had been renovated, no longer a symbol of sin, but transformed into the Elena Grace Holloway Memorial Chapel, a place where people could come to pray and leave messages for the forgotten souls. On the wall hung a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The truth may come late, but it always finds its way back." Sergeant Dana Morales was invited to speak at the dedication ceremony. She didn't say much, just recounted the investigation's journey, one that began with a cold case file and ended with a simple truth, that silence can kill too. "We can't fix what happened," she said, "but we can choose not to turn our backs on the truth again." Applause rose, soft but lasting. Dana looked around, catching familiar faces. People who had once opposed, doubted, stayed silent. Now they stood here together, sharing a new faith, not just in belief, but in humanity. After the ceremony, she stepped out into the yard, where the wind rustled through the oak trees, sunlight filtering through the leaves, shining down on the sparkling lake. A teenage girl brought a bouquet of white flowers to place under the plaque, whispering, "My mom said she went to school with Elena. I just wanted to leave a hello." Dana smiled, a strange warmth rising in her chest. Perhaps this was what Elena deserved, not pity, but to be remembered with gratitude. Detective Keene had fully retired, living quietly in the suburbs south of Knoxville. He no longer investigated, but occasionally still got letters from Dana. In one she sent that summer, there was just one sentence: "We didn't find justice, we found our humanity again." He read that line over and over, then placed it on the table next to an old photo of the two of them in front of Cedar Grove Church, on the day the case closed. In Knox County Jail, Reverend Whitlow passed away in his sleep, just a few months earlier. The news ran in a brief item on page 3 of the local paper. No one attended the funeral except a few old parishioners and his elderly lawyer. On his gravestone, there was no title, just 4 words: "A seeker of forgiveness." In the end, Knoxville was no longer a town haunted by a case. It became a place where people retold the story of redemption and the courage to face the past. Every fall, residents still gathered by the lake, lighting candles for Elena, and for all those who had once been lost in their own darkness. In the flickering light reflecting on the water, Sergeant Dana Morales sometimes still stood silently, not as an investigator anymore, just as someone who stayed, a witness to the truth, to loss and to faith reborn. The sun set slowly over Melton Hill Lake, bathing all of Knoxville in pale orange. Sergeant Dana Morales stood at the water's edge, watching the small waves lap around the pier's base. Across the lake, the steeple of Cedar Grove Memorial Chapel peeked through the old oaks, a place that had once been the center of pain, now a symbol of redemption and courage. 33 years had passed. The Elena Grace Holloway case wasn't just closed in police files, but had become part of the town's shared memory. It changed the way people looked at each other, at justice, and at their own consciences. For Dana, it wasn't just a case, it was a journey witnessing humanity confronting the darkness in their own faith. She remembered the early days when she reopened the file, the yellowed old photos, the reports lacking details, the repeated lines of insufficient evidence. Back then, the case was just a forgotten name in a list of hundreds of Tennessee's cold cases. But what kept Dana from letting go was Elena's eyes in the portrait photo, pure, yet carrying a plea. She realized that behind every old file was a real person, with family, hopes, dreams left unfulfilled, and sometimes, all it takes is one person believing the truth is still worth seeking, and it finds its way back. After the memorial chapel dedication, many sought out Dana to say thank you. An elderly woman said that because of this story, she had found the courage to recount the abuse she'd endured years ago. A father said he'd started talking to his daughter again after watching a news segment on the case, and students in Knoxville high schools wrote essays on the power of truth and forgiveness. Dana listened to it all, but in her heart, she thought only one thing: sometimes, justice isn't in the courtroom, but in how we treat each other after the truth is revealed. The story of Reverend Whitlow made many reflect too. He wasn't a monster, nor entirely innocent. He was proof that a person can be both good and weak, preaching light while being swallowed by the darkness inside. His sin wasn't just the accident, but 32 years of silence, the silence that drowned the whole town in lies. When Whitlow died, Dana went to the cemetery and placed a white flower on his grave, not to forgive, but to close the circle, because she understood, truth doesn't redeem anyone, but it frees everyone. A year later, the 1988 Holloway file was officially closed. In the summary report, the last line handwritten by Dana: "The case ends, but the lesson continues." She filed a copy in her drawer, next to the small necklace engraved with EGH, that she still kept. Sometimes, at the end of the day, she'd take it out and look at it, a reminder that every investigation starts not from evidence, but from compassion. Knoxville today is different from before. People no longer avoid mentioning the case, they tell it as part of the town's history, a sad but necessary story. Cedar Grove Church now welcomes visitors every week, not just for prayer, but as a space for those who want to speak what they've hidden. By candlelight, people write small notes: "I was wrong, sorry for the silence, thank you for not giving up." They're all pinned to the wall behind the altar, forming a tapestry of confessions and forgiveness intertwined. One afternoon, Detective Keene sent Dana a handwritten postcard from his retirement spot. "Some cases never really close, we just learn to live with the truth." She read it, smiled, then looked out the window, the Knoxville sky clear and serene, unlike the gray rainy days of 1988. In the sunset, the chapel bell tolled long and soft, like a whisper from the past. Dana understood that every case eventually grows old, every person eventually forgotten, but what remains, the courage to face the truth, and the kindness to forgive, is what shapes a community, and saves people from the very shadows they create. The story of Elena isn't just a case closed after 33 years, it's the journey of a whole town learning to grow up. Now, every time she passes Melton Hill Lake, Dana stops, dropping a flower onto the water. She no longer thinks of sins or fears, only peace, because she knows, somewhere beneath that shimmering water, Elena finally rests in peace, and Knoxville, after all, has found its light again. The story of the Elena Grace Holloway case in Knoxville is not just a personal tragedy, but also a mirror reflecting how American society today is still grappling with the wounds left by silence and fear. In the story, Reverend Whitlow is not a typical villain. He is a good man bound by the fear of losing the image, reputation, and faith that he represents. It was his silence, and that of the surrounding religious community, that buried the truth for more than 30 years. That detail vividly reflects a common problem in modern life. We often choose silence in the face of wrongdoing, out of fear of trouble, fear of judgment, or a desire to protect the good image of ourselves and the organizations we belong to. But that silence, even if stemming from good intentions, can prolong pain and squander opportunities for justice to be served. In American society today, as debates about justice, faith, and ethics grow increasingly complex, Elena's story reminds us that honesty and the courage to speak the truth are not just individual actions, but the foundation for a community to develop healthily. People like Sergeant Dana Morales, who dared to persistently pursue a case that seemed long cold, remind us that justice doesn't come from power, but from compassion and perseverance. Whether in work, family, or society, the lesson of Knoxville still holds its full value. Don't let fear make us choose silence, because sometimes all it takes is one person who dares to speak for an entire community to rediscover the light. Thank you for joining us on this journey to reclaim the light of justice, after more than 3 decades of silence in Knoxville, where the truth finally speaks out. If you believe every story deserves to be heard, please subscribe to catch the next journeys with us.